Along with death and taxes, one of life's great certainties is that when defending the Latin Mass, you will always have some mental giant crawl out of the woodwork who will snarkily remind you that the Last Supper wasn't celebrated in Latin. I have gotten this comment multiple times on every single video I've ever made about the Latin Mass. The people who make this comment really believe it's some kind of intellectual coup de grace. Oh, you think Mass should be said in Latin? Well, guess what? Did you know the Last Supper was celebrated in Aramaic, not Latin? Checkmate, trads. It's really a juvenile argument in the same category as Protestants arguing against purgatory because the word isn't mentioned in the Bible. But its prevalence suggests that it nevertheless carries a lot of weight with people. So, today I want to dive into this a little and explore why this is an extremely bad argument to make against the traditional Latin liturgy. The first thing I'd say to this argument is that the Mass is not supposed to be a historical reenactment of the Last Supper. In its commemorative aspects, the Mass certainly memorializes the Last Supper, but it's not meant to be a historical reenactment. If we set aside the words of institution, which are quotes from the Gospels, the other prayers of the Mass don't follow the structure of the Last Supper, nor do the vestments, the ritual gestures, the music, or anything else in any rite of the church. None of this is meant to approximate to the historical details of the Last Supper. Why then get hung up on the issue of language? While we're on the subject of language, what is the point of stressing Aramaic instead of Latin? Are those who oppose Latin suggesting that we should say our liturgy in Aramaic instead? I'm guessing not. People who object to Latin do so because they think the Mass should be in the vernacular, in our case, English. So, what is the point of stressing Aramaic over Latin when what you actually want is the Mass in English? Now, I assume they will respond that it's not about Aramaic per se, it's about the fact that Aramaic was the vernacular at the time and that the Last Supper was celebrated in vernacular. But it's not even true that the Last Supper was said in Aramaic, at least not entirely. The people who make this objection seem to forget that the Last Supper itself was a celebration of the Jewish Passover, many prayers of which, if not all of them, would have been said in their traditional Hebrew forms, which by the time of Christ was a strictly liturgical language that was no longer comprehensible to the average Jew. First century Jews used a liturgical language for their rituals just as Catholics used Latin. But to get to the real point, people seem to fundamentally misunderstand the concept of a liturgical language. Liturgical language is a sacred language that is reserved for religious worship. It's not a concept unique to Catholicism. Hinduism has Sanskrit, Islam has Arabic, and Judaism has Hebrew. These sacred languages transcend regional dialects. They create a universal medium that binds believers together in shared worship. They anchor people to ancient texts and traditions, ensuring doctrinal consistency and cultural continuity across generations. The distinct and generally non vernacular nature of liturgical languages elevates ritual, instilling reverence and creating a wall of separation between the sacred and the mundane. Liturgical language safeguards a people's spiritual and intellectual legacy while facilitating the worshiper's connection to the divine. Now, this all holds true for Latin in the Catholic Church. Retaining Latin as a liturgical language holds immense value for the Church's universality, historical continuity, and its spirituality. Latin is capable of transcending national and cultural boundaries, uniting all Catholics worldwide in a timeless language of worship that fosters a sense of global communion, essentially reflecting the Church's Catholicity. It connects today's faithful to centuries of tradition, preserving the theological precision, the aesthetic beauty of ancient texts like the Roman Missal. And the non vernacularity of Latin elevates the sacredness of the liturgy, encouraging reverence and contemplation by distinguishing it from everyday speech. And the stability of Latin ensures that liturgical texts remain unaltered by shifting linguistic trends, thus safeguarding doctrinal integrity across generations. Now, as good as all this sounds, is this preferable to celebrating the Mass closer to how the Christians of the first century celebrated? You might ask, if we are going to be sticklers for tradition, shouldn't we want to replicate the earliest liturgies as closely as possible? While I understand the sentiment here, this thinking is misdirected. Tradition does not simply mean whatever is oldest. We should rather think of tradition in terms of a totality of what has been handed down, especially those elements that have been most prevalent within that great heritage. So we do not treat the faith like a barnacle encrusted ship where we are constantly trying to scrape away the accumulation of centuries to find some pristine ancient hull free from historical accretions. Rather, those very historical accretions, in continuity with what came before, become the very expressions of the church's heritage. Besides, we honestly have very little idea of how the liturgy was celebrated in the first centuries of the church. Oh, sure, there are little texts and prayers and hints that have come down, but none of this is substantial enough to recreate any rite with anything approximating to certainty. This means that modern liturgical texts and practices, ostensibly based on the early church, are not anything close to replicas of ancient practice so much as modern interpretations, maybe loosely inspired by ancient praxis. And often not even that, as these modern practices are sometimes just freely invented. Yes, the Last Supper was not said in Latin, but this is not and has never been relevant to how the Mass should be celebrated. Whatever was happening in the early days of Christianity, the Liturgy of the West ultimately crystallized in form and content into an exclusively Latin language ritual, and thus was it passed on for over 1,500 years. A development we can only conclude was directly willed by the Holy Spirit, at least if we believe the Church's tradition has developed under inspiration, which every Catholic really ought to. Hey, before you go, I want to take a minute to tell you about the St. John Ogilvie prayer book. It's always disgusted me how contemporary Celtic spirituality is so infused with New Age gobbledygook when there's such a rich heritage of Catholic tradition in the Celtic world. It is to redress this problem that I've published the St. John Ogilvie prayer book, a collection of prayers and blessings in the Celtic tradition that are solidly Catholic. Compiled by Dr. Joe Johnson and featuring an introduction by none other than the great Archbishop Athanasius Schneider, this prayer book features prayers in English, Latin, and Scots Gaelic. All of the Church's regular universal texts are included, along with traditional Catholic Scotch-Irish prayers. There are daily prayers for morning and evening, blessings and invocations for all sorts of events, seasonal prayers, and litanies reflecting the saints of Ireland and Scotland. Bound in high quality leatherette with thin gilded pages and ribbon, the St. John Ogilvie Prayer Book will make a beautiful addition to your treasury of spiritual reading, especially if you are one of the millions of Catholics who have Scotch Irish blood in your veins. They can be purchased at the Cruachan Hill website, link in the description, and if you use the promo code UNAM at checkout, you can get 15% off. The books are ready to ship and would make a lovely gift for birthdays or holidays, so click the link below and get your copy of the St. John Ogilvie Prayer Book today.